All right. Oh, it asked me if I want to stick around or leave. I'll stick around. There we go. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with Zoom. There we go. Okay. Like I was saying, I'm sorry. So especially since the early 2000s, we have witnessed a surge of publications dealing with animals in literature beyond that more traditional anthropocentric approach that really relegated them into being these mere androcentric symbols. And that's just a very, of course, very short selection of titles that you have there on your screen. But of course, we have studies on the representation of animal subjectivity through different literary devices, so in rhetoric, in imagery, narratology, poetic form, setting, etc. We have studies about the literary exploration of non-human others as sentient beings, studies about the literary depiction of a particular species, studies about the significance of non-human other animals and or certain species as cultural capital within a given region or within a historical setting, etc. And then we have CAS and animal studies related journals, such as the Journal for Critical Animal Studies, which we're all very familiar with, or the Animal Studies Journals, which have published articles related to the field of literature in the past few years. And we've also witnessed how established literary journals and cultural studies journals, which also invite the discipline of literature in their publications, how they've increasingly first tolerated and now I would say welcomed studies that have to do with animal studies or with critical animal studies. Needless to say, we've also seen how very prominent publishing houses have created entire series dedicated to animal studies and literature. And of course, do mention here, mention is due to the Palgrave Studies in Animals and Literature series directed by Susan McHugh, Robert McKay, and John Miller. And you have there just, again, a very brief selection of the last titles having come out, but this is a wonderful series. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. Other publishing houses also have animal studies related series and include multiple publications connecting animals and literature in their collections. So we have the Animal Turn series by Michigan State University Press, or the Routledge Human Animal Studies series, and so on and so forth. So we've seen that sort of progress within research. But that said, I'd like to briefly use my time here, not so much to talk about how research is evolving, how CAS is evolving within literary research per se, but to consider that other aspect within the academic profession, which would refer to, of course, teaching and that classroom environment, at least when it comes to literary studies. Well, how CAS is what it provides, what it hampers when it comes to the integration of CAS and animal studies related issues in the classroom. So of course, as we all know, when one is proactive in a given cause, you become very much aware of the extent to which you can or have to adjust your discourse to both the context and the interlocutors. Because how communication is structured and narrativized, of course, varies greatly, and such variations demarcate this sort of often blurry line between more traditional conceptions of activist discourse and what is, of course, expected of a classroom environment. So with this in mind, I'd just like to briefly offer some insight gathered from my own those are my kids screaming, I'm sorry. Gathered from my own very humble experience as a university professor in the field of literature. Even though, and I cannot emphasize this enough, my field of research, it's not didactics, it's not pedagogy. I do CAS and animal studies and literature, so that's my field of research. However, of course, having taught literature for a number of years now and having attempted to integrate animal studies and CAS perspectives in the classroom, I think, that's what I want to share here, but this is not my area of research per se. And I think this is important to emphasize because what I'm about to share or sort of present here in the hopes of, getting some feedback from people are just a few observations that have slowly evolved throughout the years, but that have not been statistically measured or quantified or qualified in any event, in any way. So anyway, to get back to that classroom environment. So obviously we have to think some of the contextual aspects here. So the first thing you have to deal with when you're in academia, obviously, and you want to include these sorts of perspectives and newer, and like Richard was saying before, we have been the underdogs, and that's sort of changing now. And I think the theme of this conference is great because it allows us to refer to the relevance of that change. And I think we can see that very well, at least when it comes to the humanities and literary studies. So you have to know what your options are to creatively and coherently integrate animal studies in the syllabus, insofar as one is allowed to make certain changes in the program. Now, in my case, I have found it much easier in terms of the flexibility of the syllabus to integrate CAS and animal studies within subjects that have more to do with critical theory, as opposed to subjects that have to do with literary history. So usually in the curricula, that's what you will get, at least in Spain. You'll have subjects related to, theoretical aspects, and then subjects that just go, like poetry in the 20th and 21st century, or narrative, and very, very historical approaches to literature or genre-related approaches. And in particular, I've been approximately, for about 7 to 8 years now, teaching a subject called, it's a first-year course, and it's called Practical Criticism Applied to Literature in English, in which what we have is this sort of cookie-cutter approach. So we'll take a text and analyze it through different critical fields, such as Marxism or archetypal theory, psychoanalysis, reader response, eco-criticism, gender studies, critical race theory, and one of them that I've been trying to include here is animal studies and critical animal studies. And usually I'll have around 60 to 80 students per group, which is a lot, but that's just how we roll in Spain, right? Lack of budget. So 60 to 80 students in a class to teach this, that's sometimes we're a bit way in over our heads. I've also introduced CAS and animal studies at an MA level, in a subject called Research Methods in English Literature, in the master's program in English Studies that we have. And there's a unit there that deals with literary critical approaches. So I'll try to integrate that in the same way that I do in the degree. And here I'll have an average of 15 to 20 students. I think one of my old students is here in the room. Thank you for that, Sophia. Anyway, moving on, also things to keep in perspective here and to think about when we think about that classroom environment. Obviously the student profile, okay, so in my case, and I think this goes for all of the humanities in general, or at least it's my feeling, 80 to 85% of the students will be women, approximately, the average of 18 to 23 years old, okay? Type of institution, whether it's a public or a private university, because that allows you to see, the extent to which you're actually allowed to be flexible with these matters. And also becoming increasingly aware of the wider context in which you are teaching, of course, in my case, Spain. And Spain is, I would say, to summarize things in a very quick manner, it's a country that has evolved favorably in the sensitizing of society regarding animal welfare and animal protection and animal rights issues, albeit slowly. But I think we have made some progress, and due acknowledgement here is to, the wonderful associations and NGOs, the Center for Animal Ethics that the University of Pompeu Fabra has and that hosted the last EACAS conference. All these organizations and institutes and whatnot, they've certainly been very much responsible for this progress. But still, of course, it's a country that has its hallmark species practices when it comes to, especially to the food and the entertainment industries, are very famous Mundo del Toro, and of course there's a lot of hunting, fishing, culinary practices. And it's also a country, I think, that politically, because we've been living in the last few years such a political turmoil, I think there we go, are dismissed once more as infantile. Now, in my experience with these groups of texts that are part of the children's lit category, students not only resist, for the most part, inductively inferring ethical theories with their emotional response as a starting point, but they are also increasingly becoming more comfortable with proclaiming that their first initial response, that it should not be checked, it should not be revised, and it should not be corrected. In other words, they very firmly stand their ground and hold fast to these responses to a text that has this Manichaean division between good and evil, and that is so very easily laid out for them. And they are aware that the presentation of a worldview that is black or white is what is influencing their stance, and still they tend to hold fast to that and embrace that emotional response to the text. You know, I'm in a meeting, honey. Sorry. And that's not the case with texts that might be perceived as more adult-oriented, such as, for instance, Coetzee's The Lives of Animals, which I'm assuming that we're all familiar with, and that has this character of Elizabeth Costello in there, or even Alice Walker's essayistic short story, classic short story, Am I Blue? And these texts stir theoretical debates more easily, and they prompt discussions, beginning with terms such as speciesism and Derrida's animaux, animal rights, animal welfare, animal sentience, and you can even use them to discuss certain behavioral patterns such as learned helplessness. And I have found that in this case, students find their comfort zone in reasoning and in dialectics through which to sort of quantify and qualify their ethical measures. And in these cases in which these texts constitute the students' first encounter with the subject of animal ethics and literature, when this happens, they will, for the most part, very much resist that emotional, empathetic response, which they will often dismiss as being counterproductive, childish, demagogic, or even populist. And I'm underlying here demagogic and populist because these are two very trendy terms precisely in politics itself, at least within the Spanish political panorama. And it's interesting to see how they're being incorporated in their responses to animal ethics and literature. Now, as expected, it's the text's particular addressing of what we have all come to refer to as the dreaded comparison, which makes students particularly skeptical of animal ethics. So the sobering comparisons that Elizabeth Costello, for instance, makes between animal exploitation and the Holocaust, or that Walker's narrator makes between animal exploitation, meat eating, and the American slaveocracy, all that is perceived in such a way that many students think that it's very disrespectful to fall back on an emotional response. And of course, much has been written about this comparison in the field of ethics and philosophy and art criticism and art in general. And it's really not my intention to dwell upon it here, but I do think that it is important for us as educators, whether as activists or as lecturers, to really sit down every now and again and think about the long-term effects that these comparisons can make on people, whether they're effective or not. In the discipline of literature, of course, what we seek, our number one objective, is to train active readers to constantly question the text at every level, at different levels. And of course, the comparison is useful in that way. But is it efficient from a CAS perspective? And that's a much harder question to answer. I'm not too sure about that. Student responses are more scattered in these cases than in the case of, when they have that pre-critical response. And some will comply with animal ethics stances and find in the theory and terminology the tools necessary to successfully cement their arguments. And others will counter-argue on the basis of there being populism and demagogy, and there being a frivolous connection between animals and human victims of ethnic cleansing and racism. And although they criticize emotion, eventually the discussion gets very heated up, and many of them will, in in the end, make personal accusations towards their classmates who are debating with them in terms of their personal ethical choices. So indeed, this long established correlation between speciesism and sexism and racism is still very tricky from an educational perspective. As is the use of images to illustrate that. I haven't found it quite useful to include images that might, in the teaching of literature, when you're trying to include these topics, connecting factory farming and the Holocaust, or with slavery. I'm not sure if in the long run, the extent to which they are effective in that way, or whether students tend to have more of that sort of strange reaction. But of course, this is a topic that continues to be discussed within the very exploration of animal activism. However, and to end on a more positive note, I'm almost done here. The types of discussions brought on by more adult-oriented texts such as these do seem to be more perennial than the more short-lived emotional responses that students have to children's literature, which makes all the sense in the world, of course. So whether they comply with animal ethics or not, in the end, I think that what we do have to underline is the importance of equipping them with arguments and applied terminology that really helps to normalize this debate, because that is what it is about in the end. And therefore, to advance the incorporation and the institutionalization of CAS and animal studies in the humanities and in the university at large. So student responses constitute very helpful information through which to continue testing, exploring, and strategizing about educating about animal ethics. And the teachable moment, therefore, in the end, I guess it cannot be mystified as this moment of revelation in which students are converted into this non-anthropocentric worldview. I just think of it as a very small space, limited by multiple external and internal factors, within which we can, if we're lucky, equip a few with the discursive skills through which to bring the discussion beyond the academic walls. Thank you. I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Claudia. Let me just explain. Brett was originally chairing, and then he had an internet connection issue, so I came in. And because I have personally restarted the recording, I now need to remain as the chair. Otherwise, we'll have another break in the recording. Thank you very much for that paper. What I caught of it, it spoke really beautifully to the conference theme as well. So I'm sure we'll have a chance a little bit later to come back to your paper with the discussion and the Q&A. Okay, so as Brett explained, we did have a withdrawal, so we've just got 2 papers in this session, and the next paper is by Emily Major. And let me just quickly introduce Emily for everybody. So Emily is a PhD candidate in human animal studies at I'm assuming at the very well-known centre at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. And her thesis research focuses on the framing of the Australian brush-tailed possum as a pest, in quotation marks, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and considers how the strategic use of compassionate conservation could potentially alleviate some of the suffering and cruelty that is directed towards the indefensible possum and, in quote, pests more generally. Okay, I'm just going to give that abbreviated version of the biography, if that's okay, Emily. So I have to do that for quite a few people. So are you okay? Do you want to share a screen or?
Yeah, right. If you don't mind.
Go ahead, yeah.
Have it all set up. I hope it will go well, but let me know if something doesn't seem to go right. Yeah, and I just wanted to actually start off and just saying thank you to the conference organizers and Claudia. That was a really fantastic presentation, and there's actually a lot of overlap, even though we're in different areas of CAS, but I think, yeah, maybe you'll see what I mean. There's some overlap here about what kind of narratives we're discussing here. All right, let me get to it. Share my screen. All right. So I'm actually going to be discussing tonight or today. I'm in New Zealand at the minute, so as you can likely imagine, it's evening for me. So I'm actually going to be discussing my research that I've been gathering at the moment for my PhD, which, as was introduced, is through the New Zealand Centre for Human Animal Studies. It's actually around the framing of possums and the institutionalized violence in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the case for compassionate conservation. As you can likely tell, I do not have a Kiwi accent. I'm actually from Canada, so I'm kind of just all over the place at the minute, but I apologize if I speak too quick. That's definitely something I need to work on. Let's get into it. I do think it is actually really important to briefly kind of go over what a brush-tailed possum is to kind of give you context for the remainder of this presentation. So the Australian brush-tailed possum was introduced to New Zealand in 1858. They tried unsuccessfully to do it many years prior, but 1858 was the time that possums were quote unquote naturalized. They're nocturnal arboreal folivores. They eat primarily vegetation. They're really great climbers. They've got a prehensile tail, and they usually have one young per year. And so this is kind of just something to consider. And as noted, I do like to say pest with quotations. I actually don't like using the word pest, excuse me. But if you have ever been to New Zealand, or if you are aware of the possum's plight in New Zealand, they are very much considered the most hated pest in the entire country. I'm confident in saying that. But for me, I like to emphasize that it is a cultural construction, and there are fluid representations of what that means. And I also find it's important to critique what this even means for a possum to be a pest, and who gets to make those choices. And it was really interesting last year, though extremely unfortunate for the brush-tailed possums in Australia and the other animals that were impacted by the bushfires, how that species in one context was treated completely different than how they're treated here in New Zealand. It's quite heart-wrenching, really. And though Daily Mail is an absolute not a credible newspaper, it is something to actually consider about what pests, if there's a crossover and how this understanding of what a pest is there a potential for that to cross over to human populations if we are doing this process of othering? And it's really something to consider. What do you do when there is a pest infestation? You exterminate it. And there really is a campaign here in New Zealand to completely get rid of possums as pests. And you'll see a little bit later kind of more context as to why that's happening and how I'm trying to challenge it. So as for my thesis, I am splitting it into two different kind of sections. The first part, I'm looking at dominant possum as pest narratives that I will be doing through observational fieldwork and text and media analysis. And then the second part, which is a lot more positive, is exploring alternative narratives from multiple different sources, but these are narratives that challenge what constitutes a pest and challenges these categories that are given to the possum. And as you can see with some of these headlines, it's absolutely atrocious. Some of the things that not only children participate in, but this is completely normalized in New Zealand. It's hard to explain because when I moved here to New Zealand, this was very new to me, but this is very normal, unfortunately. So what I'm hoping to do is actually find solutions that are rooted in compassionate conservation that could not only help the possums by alleviating suffering and cruelty, but to also try to improve conservation education to really focus on compassion and empathy, even if it is a quote unquote pest animal. And the way that I'm doing this, I've already done the mainstream narrative analysis, and I'm currently going through the alternative narratives. Essentially, the mainstream narratives I was looking at I physically went to places and did kind of a geographical observational field work at different places where possum narratives are produced and consumed. So that would be either at predator-free sanctuaries, which is not the bottom left picture, but the one kind of second to left, where they have these sanctuaries for native birds, and essentially it's pest-free. And also going to national parks, going to national museum and wildlife reserves, and just seeing what messaging about possums or about other pest animals is being relayed there. And I also looked at textual analysis as well. I would have loved to have gone further in this, but I think that's going to be something I have to do for a later project. But just looking at these narratives. So what narratives are children learning when they're growing? What kind of promotional material is available? What kind of signage is out there? This awful book, Possum Hunt, please don't ever look at it. Don't take it out, because I don't want this guy getting any money from it. No, it sounds awful, but no, it's a really bad book. Essentially, this adult takes his kid around and tries to show him about hunting possums. And as you can see in the picture in the middle, they're very little children that are learning about pest control. And there's really not a discussion around here about suitability and whether these children are, well, whether they should be participating in pest control. But this is something that is a generational issue. Children are being raised with this. And you can see it's really impacting even just fundraisers. So those two, what do you call them? Ads? Oh, I can't think. Those two photos here at the bottom in the middle are just some promotional content for possum hunts. So the fatter, the heavier the possum you get, the more money you might make, and it actually benefits schools. So as you can see, Possum Purge, Jury School is the one that with the wanted. And there was even actually a cell phone game for young children called Possum Stomp, which is where these zombie possums are killed by a giant kiwi, which is kind of the national iconic bird. So there's a lot going on here. But what I'm doing now, which is luckily a little bit more lighthearted, well, maybe not lighthearted, but positive, is actually looking at alternative narratives. So I've been doing semi-structured interviews and questionnaires with people who, from a wide variety of backgrounds, disagree with this mainstream narrative. And they do come from a wide range of people, and they don't necessarily believe the same thing, but I'm just challenging that dominant narrative and seeing what I can find. Essentially what I'm finding at the minute is that it's extremely complicated, and that there are many different avenues to which this institutionalized violence is really manifesting itself. So one example would be through our government legislation here in New Zealand, where animals are considered sentient under the law, but there is a list of exceptions, and that includes possums, and other pest animals. So those actually don't count towards that. So if they're not considered sentient, then it kind of justifies a lot of ill treatment towards them. Popular culture here, it's actually framed as eco-friendly to be, it's eco-friendly to hunt and buy possum fur and to use it. It's also considered, as you can see here, cruelty-free, which is debatable, but and then you can also get these awful gifts in shops, unfortunately. So it's really something that's just normalized here. There's also the economy. So this is a massive topic, so I could go on for days about 1080, which is those baited pellets there, which essentially get aerial drops of 1080 around the country in areas where it's too difficult for hunters and trappers to get into the bush. 1080 baits are supposed to be for rats, stoats, and possums, but they do end up killing a lot more than the target species. Anyways, the factory that actually makes 1080 is owned partially by the New Zealand government. So the creation of these pest control baits are actually funded, partly it's Crown funded as well. So it's this idea of the economy, and do we really want to get rid of pests if we're actually just cycling our money through. And then there's also conservation, which is the area I look at the most, and just considering how these dominant narratives of possums as pests make people behave in certain ways and how this social conditioning really presents itself. And in order for this predator-free 2050, which is this idea that the government is committing to getting rid of rats, stoats, and possums by the year 2050, and they will basically do anything possible for that to happen, and that includes dropping the 1080 over the countryside. But every single person in New Zealand has to follow this in order for that to come true. So it's a very dominant narrative that's pushed here. And seeing this framing of possums in action is actually really interesting to chart over time. And especially I've been doing this about 2 years and studying this. And the more that I come across, the more that I'm saddened by it, but I'm also more of an activist, and I'm really trying to push these boundaries, because without having to read the entire Dr. Jan Wright's piece, she basically wrote that 1080 is, they should use more of it, essentially. But I'd like you to actually look at the language that's being used here. So as you can see near the bottom, possums, rats, and stoats that have invaded our country will not leave of their own accord. However, possums were brought here by humans for human gain. Much of our identity as New Zealanders, along with the clean green brand with which we market our country to the world, is based on these ecosystems these pests are bent on destroying. And we cannot allow our forests to die. So this is just, if you kind of imagine with me, like this is the kind of narrative that really I'm kind of coming up against, and I'm really trying to untangle this, because a lot of what's being presented as fact is actually disputed, but it's a mess. And part of what makes this a successful campaign is that they state that possums prey on invertebrates and the eggs and young chicks of native birds. But there's been studies that have been done that show, and you can kind of see in the bottom right with sweet apple ale, if you look at the stomach contents, this was hundreds of possums that they dissected, and they actually found that the stomachs had less than 0.1 of any invertebrates. And so it's really something that they're pushing to benefit New Zealand, and you'll see what I mean here. So I've basically been analyzing my interview transcripts and my questionnaire transcripts, and these are the emerging themes that I'm finding that people are pointing out about these alternative viewpoints and perhaps why this aggressive framing of possums is happening. And one kind of primary thing that I keep coming back to, because part of my background is in animal geography. So what bodies are allowed to exist here and what bodies are not allowed to exist here. If any of you have ever been to New Zealand, or if you've seen photos, tourism photos, sheep are, and I can't even remember the statistics, but the amount of sheep in this country is, it's like 1 in 4. I can't remember, I'm sorry. Basically, sheep are allowed to be here, but possums aren't. And it's really something to consider about who gets to decide what bodies are allowed to exist in a place and who isn't. There's a lot of corruption and miseducation that's occurring, and a lot of people are bringing up ideas about who actually funds this research that people are producing. That picture in the top right was actually from 1991, and it's one of the only pictures they have of a possum predating on an egg. But what motivations are there to frame possums as pests? There's also economics. So what bodies are both valuable and controllable? In both the example of cattle and sheep, unfortunately, the systems that are in place, they're a lot easier controlled than possums, which, I mean, as I kind of mentioned earlier, they're nocturnal, they have more, they live in the deep, deep bush. So it's very difficult to actually be able to control them. There's also these narratives of patriotism and this war against pest animals. There are these strange politics of New Zealand versus Australia and seeing possums as these Aussie invaders. Pest control really restores the human right to exploit the land as we see fit. And this graph here, this photo, as you can see, like, I can't even describe it. I live in one of these pastoral areas in the south part, the south part of the South Island, and it's just farm everywhere. And it is very interesting to consider about what bush or what native land are we actually trying to protect when a vast majority of the country is dairy and farms. There's also these ideas I've been coming up with, looking at my research about colonialism and decolonialism, and what does it mean to return New Zealand to this paradise? And what I'm really trying to challenge is that possums are actually not villains. They are victims of settler colonization, and they should be treated as victims, not villains. And then it kind of switches, even though my primary interest is actually about possums and protecting animal rights here. I do recognize that perhaps for me to be the best advocate, it's to also recognize that especially humans here in New Zealand aren't really receptive to animal rights perspective. So if I can frame it and focus on this link between violence to animals and how it might be related to violence towards humans. Unfortunately, they do have these possum throwing competitions that are absolutely awful. There's also normalization and celebration of abuse. So abuse to certain kind of animals is permitted and encouraged. They have these really awful dressing up dead possum competitions as well. And you'll see this theme where children are being thrust into this. And it's not that these children are bad people. They're being raised in this environment. And I'm really worried about their empathy development and what kind of education is happening here about pest control and what is happening to these children that are participating in killing of animals and making jokes out of their bodies. There's really nothing in any of the materials that I've been finding about suitability for children and pest control. And so ultimately, I haven't come to this chapter yet, so bear with me. But I will be discussing and exploring how we could potentially use compassionate conservation to alleviate the suffering towards possums. And essentially, compassionate conservation is trying to get this sweet spot of making good choices for individual animals, as well as making good choices for species and the ecosystem. Now, this example here in the bottom, it's not perfect by any means, but it is something that has been successful as a compassionate conservation initiative. Essentially, all it took in Middle Island in Australia to protect a rare group of little penguins from fox predation, all they had to do is introduce sheepdogs. And that's actually been a very successful program, though there's many ethical problems about having the dog there. And I mean, there's a lot going on, but the fact is there are potential solutions that we're not exploring. And in New Zealand specifically, some sort of deterrence. So if there's the tree scales that they have, possum sprays, some sort of sterility or contraception is something that's being explored, but unfortunately the funding comes from the government. And if the government's investing in 1080 and promoting predator-free 2050, it's very difficult to get any funding to do any sort of advocacy work and to try to challenge this dominant narrative. So essentially, it's not going to be an easy transition to kind of advocate for what I'm hoping for. There's multiple different reasons why, as you can see. The current conservation environment heavily favors what is quickest and cheapest. So how can we get rid of these pest animals as quickly as possible? Unfortunately, 1080 does take a really long time for animals to die. It targets a lot more than target species, including pet dogs. Humans can get into the water supply. It's really awful, and it's banned in many different countries. but for some reason New Zealand wants to use it. And there's also a lot of issues when it comes to research that has any sort of interest and compassion and empathy. It's basically not funded at all. And given this, I'm really hoping to use feminist approaches to research, but I do understand that I'm within a system where it's not really valuable or worthy of merit, especially when I'm critiquing the exploitation of animals. And I am taking a very emotional approach with this research. I'm very emotionally invested in it. I could talk about it for days, but my focus is really to give voices to the marginalized animals and the human communities, such as the possum rescuers that are an underground community that are doing everything they can to try to protect possums that are either hit on the side of the road and they find a baby Joey. I'm really trying to do right by that community. So to kind of finish off, the possum in New Zealand has become incredibly entangled with human issues of identity. And this perspective will take a lot of work, and it's not going to happen over the course of my thesis, but I'm really hoping that by increasing education and by providing a conduit for these alternative perspectives, maybe we can push some cracks in the foundation. Thank you for your time. That's Dobby there. He's a 9-year-old rescued possum, and he's the sweetest little dude ever. And yeah, and I'm also doing a research advocacy blog. I've only done one post, so please don't expect much. But I'm really trying to explore what it's like to be a vegan feminist activist in New Zealand and trying to push against these dominant framings because it's impossible at times. But yeah, thank you. Sorry if I went over time. I literally talk about this way too long. I don't even know how to, oh, I should probably stop. There we go.
Thanks very much.
Sorry about that. I don't even know how long I took.
Oh, but you both had lots of flexibility because of the withdrawal, so
I was like,
that's fine. It's totally on time because there's half an hour left now for discussion. And thanks for like educating us on that topic. It was
it's a shit show here. Like, it's
lots of really interesting issues. Okay, well now we have half an hour, a nice generous half an hour for conversation, discussion, Q&A with both speakers. Maybe people have questions which apply to both, or maybe people have questions for either Claudia or Emily. So I'll just open it up now, and we'll see where we go with this. Remember to unmute yourself, or raise your hand, or use the chat function. Okay. Yeah, and please do start your video up again. Carrie, I think, is the first raised hand.
Thank you, Richard. Fascinating papers, and Emily, I didn't know half of that, and it's, yeah, awful. My question is actually for Claudia, though. I'm also work in literature, and although I'm just coming into CAS, I have taught texts with students that raise issues connected to CAS, and have found it difficult. So that was really interesting to hear what you were saying. One of the texts that I've taught with students is The Vegetarian by Han Kang, which is problematic in all sorts of ways because vegetarianism is connected to mental illness, etc. But I'm wondering about your in-classroom experiences and how students reacted. You talked about personal accusations within class and things like that. And that's something I experienced when I finished that module and I got the module evaluations back. And one student had put on there that she felt the tutor had an agenda. She didn't specify what the agenda was, but I did connect it to teaching that text and wearing a t-shirt that basically says I'm a vegan on it while I was doing so. So yeah, I was just wondering what your experiences have been in the classroom.
Hi, thank you so much for your question. And yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Well, first I mean, my experience has been firstly among themselves. So like I said, I have around 60 to 80 students per group. And, you know, there's that I don't know who said at one point that if you let a conversation run its course long enough, eventually you'll end up talking about Nazism and Hitler. It's sort of, you know, they begin, and I try to keep things within, you know, a reasoning extent, and then they start getting very heated up, and I just try to mediate there, and they end up, you know, going like, well, what is your bag made of? Or I saw you have a snack here the other day, whatever. And they get into these personal accusations, which is very unproductive. And you really have to cut them short. But more interestingly, and this is what I was trying to point out, you know, they focus so much in the beginning, like I have to use reason here and reason my way into and use reasonable arguments. And then the emotion just gets, you know, in the way, one way or another. So it's just human, or you know, our nature to go in that direction, and that's happened to me quite often. It's not like it escalates into you know, anything beyond a mere personal accusation, and you just cut it short. You're like, okay, we're not here to point fingers at everyone. But personally, it has a little bit also happened to me, and this in particular, I one time I made an entire unit out of animal studies, and it occurred to me to teach them about CAS and animal studies, and I played Bold Native for them, the film. And I was expecting a more positive reaction because they had been very receptive. But I did get it, you know, it was a mere complaint to the coordinator of the program. It wasn't anything official, but it was sort of insinuating that I was trying to indoctrinate the students. And so finding that balance, it is hard. It is hard, and I guess we're all exploring to what extent we can stretch these boundaries or not, and to what extent we can make activism out of our classroom. Again, I've found it helpful for my state of mind as I concluded my paper to think about things not in terms of, am I succeeding in having people, you know, march to the tune of CAS or animal ethics. That's not what I question myself so much about anymore. It's more in the line of, am I succeeding with providing them with the knowledge and discursive tools to, you know, to argue their way into this discussion, and by doing that, whether they're against it or not, and hopefully they'll be for it, but many more, you know, you have cases in which you don't necessarily persuade people, you don't necessarily convince people, but at least you help to normalize the discussion within the classroom. And that, I think, it's not a negligible contribution, and I think it's very helpful and and very self-patting ourselves on the back for what it is that we can do in a way. But yeah, I mean, I definitely get where you're coming from, and this balancing out of, am I going too far with this? Like I said, with the images, they haven't worked with me. People have a very strong reaction to that, and I don't find them helpful anymore. As I was teaching Elizabeth Costello or Kutsi, and you bring in these images, and people are like, well, okay, enough, you know. But then again, I can use, for instance, a lot of 19th century lithographs and illustrations showing animal cruelty, and that's okay because it's strong and it's farther down the historical path, and so it's 19th century, that's 2 centuries ago, that's fine, I guess, in that sense. So I'm still learning along the way, but I can definitely relate to what you say, and I think, you know, we're going to have to keep trying to explore what our options are there and just try to read students in a better way. And it does seem to me that the growing, the growing, for instance, influence of current feminist thought, which, for instance, I can clearly see how it's being integrated very successfully within curricula and class environment here in Spain, at least. And you sort of want to go in that direction as well and jump on board with what they're doing and learn from how feminism is successfully being integrated. But I think people are still more reticent and will always be towards the animal question. And those are my impressions. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I could add a few things, but I'll allow others to come in. I think Helena might have had her hand up. I don't know if Helena wants to come in.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to both speakers for great papers, very, very fascinating. I have questions for both Emily and Claudia, I think, but I will start with Emily. I was wondering, Emily, if you have looked at all how the kids actually pick up these messages about possums, these framings. And what sort of happens in that encounter between the kids and the framings or the representations, the messages about possums in New Zealand. Because I have this idea that, we can have an extremely animal oppressive material that we present in an educational context, but it depends on who does it and in what way it is presented. In the hands of a critical pedagogue, the most oppressive material can actually become an exercise in critical discourse analysis. So it could actually work both ways, depending on who is doing the communication here and in what way.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I've been looking more into, well, I guess what I realized, my topic is so large, and there were sections that I was planning on focusing a bit more on, which did include more about how children are actually picking up these narratives, where are they getting it from? And through the interviews that I've done with people, I did choose to do adults for my interviews, but I have discussed with them about their previous experiences with possums specifically, and seeing what's really happening behind the scenes here when they were children, and kind of how these narratives are being picked up and how they're being potentially challenged. And it's incredibly complicated, because I don't think I can think of any example anywhere in the world where an animal is so hated and children at such a young age it's just normal here. It's normal that if you see a possum when you're out camping, you hit it with a piece of wood. One part of my research was looking at people's responses on social media on posts, which I decided was the worst idea I've ever had, because it was just so negative. But it is something that I've been thinking about, and how did children actually get these ideas and challenge these ideas? But it's something that's so powerful, the narrative here, trying to challenge it, like you become ostracized. I think I'm pretty lucky that I'm not from New Zealand. That's also, there's critique of that too, that I'm an outsider coming in and critiquing their way of life here, and the way that their way of caring for nature is completely different than my perspective of it. But it's so entrenched that it's something I've considered, but I'm not sure if that answered your question, but it's very complicated. And I don't know how, some children, I think, though, they were children. They were telling me stories when they were younger, some of the rescuers, and they were saying that they wanted to rescue a baby Joey that had been found in their mom's pouch after she'd been hit on the road. And so there's this weird thing going on here about Joeys being rescued, but as soon as they become adults, then the adult animal is fine to be killed. It's very complicated, but I'm not even sure what's going on here. It's like, I was completely new to this 2 years ago, and so now I'm like so complicated. Did I answer your question? I feel like
Yeah, I think it's also a matter of socialization, actually. I mean, if you speak in educational sociological terms, I'm not sure what sort of theories you're using beyond narrative theory, but that could be one way of sort of, approaching.
Yeah. No, I've been, narrative theory. I'm doing, entangled empathy. I'm trying to use that. That would be really good. I'm gonna write that down.
Thanks a lot, Emily.
Thank you.
Okay.
Maybe we have to, if somebody else wants to come in. I'm not sure, Richard.
Sure. I will actually cheekily come in, and then I noticed Tom made a comment in the chat, which I think would be worth coming back to as well. I just wanted to say, this is really interesting that in New Zealand then that there's almost then an attempt to socialize children into the normality of this violence. And yeah, that seems to be transgressing discourses of childhood innocence, which tend to be rather dominant in Western cultures as well. So I think it'd be really interesting to understand how those two things might be in tension, because usually I can't speak for New Zealand specifically, but usually in comparable cultures, childhood innocence is a really strong overriding discourse. And I'm thinking of the protectionist view in relation to children and the climate crisis, and this idea that you can't talk to children about the climate crisis until they're maybe 10 or 11, because it's going to be too scary for them. But here in New Zealand, it's like, yeah, let's whack a possum over the head and that's fine.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting tension going on there, right?
I think and it's only about possums. It's not even, and the crazy thing to me is that I have 2 pet rats. I love my rats, but rats comparatively do actually a lot more damage to the environment of New Zealand. But possums, for some reason, are treated completely different. And children are only really socialized about possums specifically, about this narrative specifically. And in any other space, that childhood innocence that you're talking about is completely honored. But for some reason, possums is a space that it's just anything goes.
Because it's tied to New Zealand nationalism, I suppose.
It's identities, belonging, and New Zealand has the highest rates of domestic violence and the Western world. And so and there's also incredibly high rates of animal abuse. So what is happening here?
Thanks. Tom, do you want to say something about your comment to the whole room using audio, or if you don't want to, then I can just read out your comment. So Tom was saying in the chat that, you don't have a mic, that's no problem. Reading excerpts from or summaries of technical papers on animal producers with students is something that you found very helpful in terms of maybe provoking empathy or something. I read what you said as the way in which, although the majority of people obviously conform to omnivorous eating practices, when people actually hear the detail of animal production, it can be shocking and jarring, and it can be a teachable moment, because it's the reality of what the practices that they take part in are actually not as clear to them as they might think. Does anybody want to speak to that at all, or ask anything completely different of either of the speakers, or just make a comment?
My hand's up, Richard. I don't know if you can see.
Okay, sorry.
Claudia's is as well.
Okay, yeah, I see them now. Who was up first?
I think I was. Okay.
Go for it, Brett.
I was interested, Claudia, in what you said about the idea of kind of teaching in this area being understood as an agenda. and it would be interesting to hear kind of more of your experience of that in others, because I'm aware there's lots of people here who are kind of engaged in education in this way. Obviously, this seems like a really odd thing because education always has an agenda, and I mean that in a positive way. The idea of kind of, you know, introducing students into matters that affect them and ideas of citizenship. So this very odd idea that education shouldn't have an agenda, but obviously what we're battling over is different agendas. But also I'm wondering whether, and I don't want to simplify this, clearly there's battles going on in multiple countries about teaching about feminism and critical race theory, and those are understood as agendas as well. But I think, again, I don't want to oversimplify this, but there is a way in which talking about issues related to gender is understood as more normal to students. There's battles over that stuff, and students will reject the idea of being called feminists and all that kind of thing. But the idea that that is a topic, my experience is kind of more normal than talking about animals is, which is understood as a wacky agenda thing over there. I'm wondering if that's your experience as well. And I'm also wondering, therefore, how do we kind of shift this idea that it's just an agenda? Which is the connection I'm making to kind of feminism and race stuff is that obviously those subjects have encountered that as well. And that's not me saying they're identical, but there's comparisons. So how do we as a group kind of normalize this stuff and stop it being understood as an agenda and we're activists and this isn't proper education, it's indoctrination?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brett. And I think probably other people who are teaching might want to chime in here as well. I think I tried to do a little bit of what you say, and I suppose there's when I go into these critical theories, like I said, it's a cookie cutter approach class. So we'll begin with archetypal theory, psychoanalysis, and then I'll introduce them to the sort of theories that have to do with identity politics and that involve ethical perceptions as well, a bit more intimately. And so the path I'll go down is gender studies, critical race theory, eco-criticism, and then on purpose, I put animal studies last because I think they've been through that, and that sort of preps them to understand the connection between sexism and racism. And I think that works better, and they're able to connect the dots a little bit more fruitfully than just going into, from an isolated context, animal studies, and just trying to naturally lead them into that helps, of course. And probably it's something that would still need to be polished here and there, but they're definitely more receptive. And I think, like I was saying, with these last couple of years of which, feminism and critical race theory have been so big, and I think we've all in animal activism or animal studies education and whatnot, we've sort of tried to sit down and say, okay, how can we use this as well? How can we make it useful? But I have found on occasion that, for instance, a lot of, like I said, I have 80 to 85% female students, and a lot of them will just draw the boundary with the, and they won't connect the gender issue with the animal issue. And I think part of that, or I would assume that part of that has to do because as soon as you bring in the animal issue, even though you're not doing it on a straightforward level, you're sort of questioning their own everyday practices such as eating and whatever, and automatically if you're telling them that there's a connection between sexism and speciesism, and then you're connecting meat eating to to the denigration of women, and they call themselves feminists, they're going to say, okay, they're going to have a reaction against that, and so that's one of the hard things that that I personally find very hard to deal and to tackle with. But I completely agree with you. I think it's a question that we ask ourselves every day, and to what extent, of course, education it has an agenda, it makes sense. and I don't know about other countries right now, but it's like I said, Spain is being so polarized in every which way, politically speaking, that there's now this very open discussion about indoctrination, constant indoctrination, like from the right-wing parties saying that, you know, too much queer and feminism in education, from the left-wing parties saying too much religious education and so forth, to the point that a couple of weeks ago we had our like national exams to access university. I was one of the people correcting these exams, and a lot of people complained because the exam on Spanish history had too many texts that had to do with the abuse of women and how women had been treated by the church. And there was a sort of reaction to that, saying, you know, already these exams are indoctrinating, and you know, our students, with our young adults with feminism and whatnot. So it's a very heated debate. I'm not sure if that answers the question at all, but I'm guessing it's continuing the discussion. But I guess we're all still exploring what we can do. But I do feel that there's a need to try to consolidate that connection with feminism, of course, and with critical race theory.
Can I ask just very quickly, just to follow up on that, because you talked about students then, how does that work in terms of colleagues? Because again, I'm kind of thinking again, in a department that I've worked in for many years, obviously everyone would of course go, of course we have to teach about gender, of course we have to teach about race. But then I go, oh, can I do a class on animals? And they go, oh, that's weird and crazy. And so even within, I can understand that kind of student resistance, but even within the academy, are you encountering that it sits off as this marginal topic?
Yeah, I guess everybody has been through that, but I have seen, at least in Spain, I've seen some progress. You know, I've been called La Loca de los Animalitos, which is like the crazy animal lady in academia, and you know, getting laughs, and people feel the right to smirk about it, and of course I couldn't care less. Like we don't care, but thankfully. And I think that this has happened to most of us, and we can see the progress that EACAS has made, and we can see the progress that animal studies has made, and we can see this in academia. And now people are just signing up so much, and we have a lot of PhD candidates. I have one in the room here, Sophia, and she's a wonderful a PhD candidate here who has undertaken animal studies as well, or Emily's work for a PhD. I mean. And I don't know, I've seen, you know, in the last maybe 10 years, very favorable progress in that sense. And no, you might get a little bit of an eye rolling, like, oh, there we go with the animals again. But other than that, I don't find people, you know, being so assertive about trying to mock you, or even sometimes, you know, just insult you and like, oh, so this, if you care about animals, it's going to mean that you don't care about children or whatever. I've never understood that logic, but and it's quite the opposite, of course, and we try to establish that connection. So I do see it gaining ground rather favorably, at least in Spain, and I think my impression is that at least in Western academia at large.
Thank you. Helena, do you still have your hand up or is that just from earlier?
No, I still have it up actually.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so I would like to pick up on this agenda problem, if you want to call it that. One way to tackle that may be to, you know, to engage a little bit in meta education, meta teaching, you know, to actually be very clear about, you know, to set the scene from the beginning. Already at the introduction of the course, be very clear to the students about what the approach that you will use and how you will do it and why. And perhaps just say, you know, these 2 hours a week, perhaps during X number of weeks, we will create this space together where the meat norm will be challenged, you know, profoundly, and we will sort of help each other to, you know, to become better critical analysts. Also in regard to these issues with meat consumption, for instance, or animal-human relationships. So be very clear about that, and you know, this scene, this space each week, we will be very respectful to each other, and we, all those of you who may be vegetarian or vegan, you will feel that the way you have chosen to live your lives is the normal thing in these 2 hours. And you know, if if need, maybe you will feel that you will not be confirmed, but everybody is welcome to, to express their views, and this is, a very tolerant atmosphere. But this is an experiment, and we will do it together. So this kind of meta approach to teaching could be helpful in order to sort of demystify, if you will, the agenda of vegetarianism or veganism in the classroom. But they're very open to your students about what you do and why.
Okay, thank you, Helena. That's a really good addition. I think a lot of this discussion nicely is prefiguring other sessions from the conference, and of course the round table this evening, if your time zone allows it. BST 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. there is an actual roundtable on education, which Helena will be speaking to, and also Dinesh Wadawa from Sydney and Vasily Stanescu from the US will be part of that too. I think we're almost having to close this session now. It's 2 minutes to 11. So I will shortly stop the recording. When you leave this room, make sure you just leave the breakout room and you don't press the leave the entire call option. And then there's a half an hour break until the next session. And in that time, obviously, you may want to go off and do things. And but if not, you'll also have the opportunity to go into one of the breakout rooms or the networking room and just randomly meet fellow delegates from the conference. Okay, so I'd like to finish by thanking both speakers for 2 really interesting talks, and I mean that sincerely. Thank you. Yeah, we have some audio. I'll clap into the microphone. Great. Okay, thank you.